Hello and welcome to Transfermarkt TV. My name is Stefan and I'm once again joined by Ben. And today's big story in the Premier League, this week's big story, the season's big story, is of course Manchester City's inconsistent start to the season. They lost to Brighton at the weekend, which was the fourth consecutive defeat for Manchester City, the first time in Pep Guardiola's managerial career that he's lost 4 games on the bounce. Ben, he talked after the game and tried to kind of downplay the significance of this. He said, as a player, he lost 5 or 6 games in a row. His Man City sides have lost games in the past. But there does seem to be a kind of lingering issue at Manchester City. They don't quite seem like their old selves. They don't seem like the team who've won 6 of the last 7 Premier League titles. There's a lot to get through here. We'll talk about a lot of things, but I'm just going to throw it to you and maybe you could just kind of lay the groundwork and say what you think has been the biggest issues for Manchester City this season.
Yeah, I think it's obviously been a terrible start. And Guardiola also did say after the game that maybe this is time. They've won 6 of the last 7 titles. Maybe it's time for someone else to win it, which I think is probably a little bit of mind games. And no one's counting them out of the title race just yet. But yeah, it has been a poor start. And to be honest, I think there was a few games before that where they've sort of got away with results as well. You look at the Wolves game where they were 1-0 down for a long time and a last-minute John Stones goal got them the 3 points there. They conceded 2 goals at home to Fulham and were torn apart for the majority of the game by Adama Traore. So it's really not been a great start. They could have lost the Arsenal game, of course, with John Stones coming up with another late winner there. But yeah, obviously, I think the main factor for me is Rodri. I think missing Rodri is just, he won the Ballon d'Or. I've said for a long time, I think he's Man City's most important player. He makes everything tick. And losing him, I do expect them to lose a lot more points this season. And I think in recent years, when we've seen it take sort of 90 plus points to win the Premier League because of the standards Manchester City have set, I think that might be slightly lower this term because obviously Arsenal have started poorly. Liverpool are flying, but I think they might drop off a little as we go forward. And Manchester City, who are usually just juggernauts at winning, I think they're going to drop a lot more points without Rodri this season. And also, I guess one of the other issues is a lot of the other attacking players aren't quite performing. Haaland's been on fire, goal scoring. But, if you look at the likes of Phil Foden, Stefan, I know you've written a brilliant piece for Transfermarkt on Manchester City's struggles and how they've sort of been over-reliant on Haaland's goals. And Phil Foden is one of the players that's been letting Man City down slightly. He hasn't scored in the Premier League or assisted, I believe, this season so far. Why do you think we've seen sort of a drop-off in his levels this term?
Yeah, it's all interconnected, isn't it? I completely agree with you. Rodri does feel like the key here. I think a lot of people, obviously, who maybe don't watch a lot of Manchester City or don't watch a lot of the Premier League, or indeed in much of Spain, probably think of Rodri as this kind of defensive enforcer in the middle of the park. He's also a big guy. He can throw his weight around. He loves to break up counterattacks. But he's also a really kind of underrated playmaker for Manchester City. Last season, I think only 3 players picked up more assists in the Premier League than Rodri. And he's just a guy who pulls the strings. He's not only the guy who sets up the assists, but he's also the guy who sets up the moves that leads to the assists, if that makes any sense. And in the piece, I made the point of saying that not only did he set up 2 of Foden's 19 Premier League goals last season directly, but he obviously played the kind of establishing pass that led to what is that kind of signature Manchester City move where they have a kind of fullback or a winger hit the byline, swing it back, or cross it, or cut it back rather, and there's Foden there to kind of tap it home. And without Rodri in that team, it does feel like the whole kind of system is kind of breaking down stage by stage. Foden's an interesting one. Last season, he got 0.6 goals per 90 and 0.25 assists per 90 in the Premier League. This time around, he's obviously picked up 0 goals and his assists are sitting at 0.2 assists per 90. But one of the things I really want to make a point of emphasising in the article is if you do kind of take a look at his availability or his fitness maybe for Manchester City, I think we are looking at a player who has struggled to get back to match fitness. He had the illness at the start of the season, pretty grueling Euros I suppose for England as well where he was quite prevalent. But the thing I noted was that last season he averaged about 82 minutes per appearance in the Premier League, which more or less suggests he was obviously a regular player or a more or less player who played just about every minute for Pep Guardiola's team. This time around, that number has dropped to 58 because he hasn't been starting games. He's been coming off. I think it's quite pertinent that he obviously dropped out of the England squad this week for this international break, claiming he was obviously not fit or not injured, fully fit. So I think we're looking at a player there who is missing Rodri in that team, who obviously provides the balls and the assists for him, but he's also a player who's still struggling for fitness. And that's kind of obviously then led to this kind of breakdown in Manchester City's attacking line, where they still have this incredible striker up front in Erling Haaland, but they don't have much else. Haaland has picked up, 12 goals in the Premier League so far this season. He broke Alan Shearer's record for the quickest player to reach 75 goals in the Premier League with his goal against Brighton. But the next top goal scorers in the Premier League for Manchester City are Mateo Kovacic and Josko Gvardiol. And then it's John Stones. There's actually no attacking player outside of Haaland who's actually got more than one goal for Manchester City. And it's bonkers. It's absolutely bonkers. I mean, I said in the piece that, he's now contributed 55% of Manchester City's league goals this season, which is truly remarkable. I'll throw the graph up, obviously, on the video and people can see, but that number was, I think 26 last season. It was obviously quite high in his first season, 38, because he had that remarkable start in the Premier League. But as we can see as well, like his time at Dortmund, where he was really the focal point of that team, and he scored a buckload of goals, which obviously led to most of Europe's top clubs trying to sign him. Even then, he wasn't as dominant or as so relied upon as he is at Manchester City this season. And Ben, that kind of takes us to probably the best kind of the next part of this video, where we kind of want to talk about where Manchester City go from here. Yes, they'll have players come back from injury after the international break. We might see Phil Foden return from injury. Obviously, Rodri will be out for a little longer. But on top of the here and now, there is this kind of long-term kind of, I don't know if I want to call it a malaise, but there is this kind of talk of, there's still huge question marks over Pep Guardiola's future, whether he'll stay at the club next season. And as a result, I guess there's still a lot of there's a lot up in the air here, Ben, which might be seeping into why this team aren't quite playing or firing all cylinders this season.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that Guardiola's future is hanging over the club this season, and I think the sooner they can get that resolved, the better. But, obviously they've had issues with injuries, but for all Guardiola's complaints about having players unavailable, he did bring on Bernardo Silva and Kevin De Bruyne against Brighton from the bench. So I don't think you can be having too many complaints if you're bringing off two world-class players like that to try and get you back in the game. But yeah, Guardiola's future, for me, it has to be resolved as soon as possible. And I just can't see Guardiola leaving at the end of the season, if Manchester City don't win anything. I don't think he'll want to go out without winning a major trophy. Like you look at Fergie, he left where they won that Premier League title, where he sort of got the best out of an aging squad. I think Man City have an aging squad themselves and really need to get that age down now with the number of their best players such as De Bruyne and Bernardo Silva going into their 30s. But I just can't see Guardiola leaving if they don't win something massive this season. If they win 5 in a row, I think, yeah, he goes and he says it's never going to be repeated. But I think the club need to resolve that his future as soon as possible, because there's no doubt it's in the players' minds. And I think in recent seasons, a lot of players have signed for Manchester City because they want to play under Pep Guardiola. If you look at the sort of hit rate of him improving players, it's very high. So if you go there, you're going to be guaranteed to be probably winning trophies or certainly challenging, and you're going to improve as a player. So I think it's also going to affect Manchester City in the transfer market, not having Guardiola's future resolved, because players are going to be less keen to come there because of the uncertainty around the club. And Erling Haaland, who quite remarkably, considering what Man City have won with Haaland since he's gone there, but he's been consistently linked with sort of Real Madrid and Barcelona since he's been at Manchester City. His contract runs out in 2027, in around 2.5 years' time. So there's rumours, if Pep Guardiola leaves, could he move on as well and perhaps go to one of those Spanish giants? But yeah, as far as Manchester City concerned, I think they need to get Guardiola's future resolved as soon as possible.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that if you look at the way that squad is put together, it does look like it's beginning to creak a little bit. It's a lot of older players. I think what's really interesting is if you look at the 11 players who've played the most football this season for Manchester City. Now, of course, we have to bear in mind there are a lot of injuries, as we've talked about, the likes of Rodri, and other maybe younger players as well. But of the 11 players who played the most football for Manchester City this season, 6 of them are either 30 or older. And then that also includes Akanji, who's 29. So, and yeah, of course, you could say Bernardo Silva, 30 years old. That's not the end of the world. But we're talking about a player here who's played a lot of football in an attacking role. And as we're seeing in the modern game, it's not really a case that every player makes it to 35 and begins to drop off. A lot of players can drop off earlier than that. And I think a good example of that is actually Ilkay Gundogan, who was brought back to the club, which I actually thought was a bit of an interesting move. It could certainly raise an eyebrow at that, simply because, watching for Germany at the Euros, he didn't look like the same player he once was. didn't quite do it for Barcelona either. And it looked like a kind of quick fix rather than what we're used to with Manchester City, which is very thorough, very long-term planning, where they do kind of have the next stars in place. They seem to have 3 or 4 world-class players for every position. It feels like this team is kind of being held together with a bit of duct tape and glue at the moment, and key players are now kind of beginning to look past their peak. I mean, the one that really stood out to me in that Brighton game was Kyle Walker, who's a player who obviously has been a great servant to Manchester City and an outstanding fullback, but it's quite abrupt. I found it quite abrupt how quickly he's beginning to kind of look off the pace, which obviously is a key part to his game. And actually, one thing that really stood out to me was in their defeat to Bournemouth recently, the average age of that starting 11 was 28.8. And only West Ham and Everton have put out teams with an older average age in that this season in the Premier League. So we're talking here about a team, Ben, that are not only getting older, relying on players that are maybe past their prime, but maybe also approached a situation here that, and something that maybe Manchester City fans might want to consider, not just the fact that Pep Guardiola might move on next season, but when he does move on, he might leave behind a squad that needs a huge amount of upheaval and maybe a real kind of hatchet taken to it and a complete rebuild in place for the next guy, which, as we know, with plenty of examples in the Premier League, their cross-city rivals, Manchester United, may be a perfect example of this, that when a kind of Goliath manager moves on, it's hard enough as it is, never mind if you have to basically rebuild your squad from scratch.
Yeah, definitely. It does feel like Guardiola has obviously built, in my opinion, the best English team of all time, is Man City team. But it feels that original team that he's built for this period of success is coming to an end. And there's not that many players in their prime at Manchester City. I mean, Haaland and Foden immediately spring to mind. But then you're looking at players that are sort of 29 plus, and then younger players that come in like Savinho and Doku, who've got a very bright future but haven't quite reached the levels yet. So it is something worrying. Yeah, Kyle Walker, I had never ever seen him like absolutely done for pace this season, but Adama Traore absolutely had his pants down at the Etihad last month. It was unbelievable. I'd never seen Walker be for pace. So that's a very worrying sign because effectively Kyle Walker has been a bit of a cheat code for Manchester City over the last couple of seasons where they play so high, where he sits in and it just completely ruins that counter-attack for teams going forward. But yeah, I think Manchester City is something they really need to think about recruitment, and I would not be surprised if in January they go and sort of make a statement signing and bring in the likes of Martin Zubimendi.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, you guys can obviously let us know in the comments below what you think. Do you think Manchester City are in trouble? Do you think it's just a blip? Do you think they'll turn things around? It's typical Manchester City. They start slow and then they end very strongly. Do you think Guardiola will stay at the club, or do you think he's planning to move on and is leaving behind a squad that will need a huge amount of upheaval? Let us know in the comments below. And if you do enjoy these videos, please do remember to like and subscribe. It does us a huge favour with the algorithm on YouTube. And we always appreciate your support. So until next time, thank you and goodbye.